Danganronpa Kirigiri, Volume 1, written by Kitayama Takakuni. Chapter 1. Murder at the Sirius Observatory. It felt like I had cried a lot while I was sleeping. What was it again that I was crying about? Did something sad happen? Or did I have that dream again? I didn't really know the reason why, but my cheeks were completely drenched with tears. When I tried to wipe them, I got the strange feeling that something was off. My right hand couldn't reach my face. My wrist hurt, and so, springboarding off of these facts, I became dimly aware. Still groggy, I slowly lifted my head to look at my right wrist. I was wearing an unfamiliar bracelet. A sturdy-looking bracelet with a black luster. And just in case I was still inclined to call it cute and fashionable, there was a chain attached to it that made it rather difficult. This really isn't the kind of thing I'm into. The chain was the biggest problem. When I tried to move my right arm, the chain went taut and prevented me from doing so. My right arm was restricted and incapable of reaching my head. I followed the chain with my eyes and saw another one of the bracelets attached to the leg of a bed. In my hazy state of consciousness, I finally started to realize the position I was in. I wasn't on top of the bed, but lying face down on the floor. I guess somehow my right wrist got handcuffed to the leg of the bed, so I couldn't move from that spot. It appeared that my right arm was the only thing restrained, so I could move the rest of my body freely. I crawled closer to the bed until I could move my right arm as freely as possible, and put both hands on the floor to push myself up gingerly into a sitting position. I felt dizzy. What exactly had happened here? Why had I collapsed in a place like this? I tried to remember, but my memory was obscured by meaningless noise. I tried adjusting my mental frequency, searching for recent memories. The first thing I remembered was that abominable sign. I briefly flashed back to the letters that were written on it. Welcome to the picturesque Sirius Observatory. Looking at that sign in the dim dusk light, I'd seen the result of someone's prank, where they'd crossed out the beginning of the word picturesque with red spray paint, writing despair instead. Welcome to the despair-esque Sirius Observatory. Oh, right. This building was called the Sirius Observatory. It was a privately owned astronomical observatory, and the building itself apparently had a distinctive star shape. Each of the 5 points of the star was a guest room, shaped like a glass-panelled isosceles triangle. The centre, a regular pentagon, was a hall with a domed ceiling, where once upon a time you could also supposedly observe the galaxy. I had apparently collapsed in one of the guest rooms. Gradually, my memory became more distinct. It's okay, I can remember. My name is Yui Samidari, age 16. I'm a detective. By the request of a prominent figure, we 5 detectives had been gathered here at the Sirius Observatory. A detective lives for requests like this one. All the more so if they're requests that imply hidden secrets. We can't avert our eyes from the allure. But the person who made the request never showed up. At this point, it was already a little past suspicion. We were tricked. Someone was plotting out a crime when they'd gathered us here. And that's how I ended up in this mess. Now that the situation was clear, dread began to settle in. I didn't know who was responsible for this, but these strange circumstances had stolen my freedom from me completely. More than anything, the fact that I was toyed with while I was unconscious gave me goosebumps. I wondered if they did anything weird to me. Well, for the time being, my only solace was that I had no pain or external injuries. Putting my glasses back on properly from where they had been lying askew, I took a look around the room. My backpack was sitting on top of the bed. That probably means this is my room. The curtains on the window were drawn. I couldn't see outside, but I could tell that it definitely wasn't light out there. Maybe it was nighttime. Or maybe it was because of the snow. A telescope was set up in the room. That wasn't something I had brought there, but something that had been there originally. But I remembered that I hadn't been able to look at the stars in the sky because of all the snow that had been falling. I suddenly turned to look over my shoulder. The door to the room was closed, so I couldn't see the state of the pentagonal hall. It's too quiet. What about everyone else? Why isn't anyone kicking up a fuss about this? Maybe everyone else was restrained like me and they can't move either. Or maybe they're still unconscious. I didn't know who was doing this, and what they were planning, but I couldn't let them keep doing as they pleased. I had to stand up to them. I was a detective after all. First of all, I had to do something about those handcuffs. I couldn't stand up as long as I was tied to the leg of the bed. There was a keyhole at the base of the chain, but I couldn't find the key. I probably can't just drag the bed along with me. The bed's legs were 4 columns, one on each of the 4 corners. The handcuffs were attached to one of them. But like this, when I really thought about it, I realized that if I could just lift up the bed, I could slip the handcuffs out from under the leg. It was a regular wooden bed that couldn't be more than a twin size. It was pretty safe to say that it was within my power. I grabbed the leg of the bed and lifted it up right away. Even for someone like me who didn't have much arm strength, I was able to lift it just barely. That was enough. I only needed to make a gap large enough to slip the handcuffs free from the bed leg. On the count of 3, I gathered my strength and lifted the leg of the bed a few more centimeters. I removed the handcuffs through that gap. Alright, regaining my freedom was actually pretty easy. I wondered if the person who got me in this mess thought that a girl wouldn't be strong enough to lift the bed. Well, if that's the case, I have to give thanks for their negligence. Finally, I was able to get up to my feet. I felt a little lightheaded, but it was fine. I did some light stretches to loosen up my body. No problem, I got this. Handcuffs dangling from my right arm, I softly opened the door and peered into the central pentagonal hall. No one was there. I prudently confirmed the status of my surroundings as I went out into the hall. A short, round wooden table was placed in the middle of the hall. Apparently, there used to be a round iron pedestal there with a gigantic telescope, but it had been removed a long time ago. Now all there was to see was empty space. The hall was quiet, with no one to be seen. A glance at the analog clock on the wall told me it was past 12 o'clock. Judging from how dark it had been outside, it was probably midnight, right after the date had rolled over. Where did everyone go? I considered calling out, but I abandoned that idea. What's that? As I was moving around the table, I saw 2 young legs poking out. Black loafers and black knee-high socks. At that moment, I understood who they belonged to. One of the other detectives who had accompanied me. Kyoko Kirigiri. She was splayed across the floor with her legs out. It looked like she had somehow collapsed face down. She didn't show any signs of movement. I went around the table and drew closer, my gaze running up her legs. They were very frail legs. The slender curves running from her calves to her pale thighs told me of her girlish physical immaturity. The pristine pelts of her skirt were intact, fanning out from her hips onto the floor. Is she okay? Just as I was about to move closer, my feet stopped on their own. Her head was lying on its right side, as if turning to face me directly. Her braid was draped across her cheek, concealing her small mouth. Her eyes were closed. Her skin looked cold, without any sense of body heat. And although that wasn't much different to how she looked from when I first met her, now it even looked more conspicuous. She's not dead, is she? No, Her small back was moving up and down, just slightly. Is she just unconscious? I couldn't tell from far away, but I hesitated to get closer to her to confirm her life status. Because a giant blood-stained pair of shears had been dropped right next to her, near her right hand. Were they pruning shears, maybe? They were the type that needed 2 hands to operate. The sturdy blades looked like they could cut through any branch, no matter how thick. Usually they would be used to prune trees or shrubs, but when you think about what they would have to had cut in order to get bloodstains on them, at first I thought it might have been her blood, but I couldn't see any injuries on her. I couldn't see any traces of blood on her clothes or on the floor either. Then whose blood was on the shears? Judging by the fact that they were dropped by her hand, was she actually the one who used them as a weapon? My fear of the situation made me hesitate to move closer. What in the world had happened to Kyoko Kirigiri? And whose blood could that possibly be? I had to find out. For the time being, I left her behind and moved across the hall. I went to the closest guest room. The door was slightly open. I slowly opened it further. The lights were on in the room. The curtains were drawn, so I still couldn't see what was going on outside. There was a person-shaped lump in the blankets on the bed. Someone sleeping. Probably one of the other detectives. From what I could see from the doorway, it looked like they were sleeping very peacefully, without taking a single breath. I hesitantly walked closer to the bed and peered over it. There was a man there, looking up at the ceiling, with his mouth slightly agape. I was pretty sure he had said his name was Eigo Amino. He was a practicing detective in his mid-30s. He showed no signs of noticing me, eyes cracked open and deeply asleep. Sorry for bothering you while you're trying to sleep. I tried calling out to him. There was no response. I could tell that it wouldn't do any good no matter how many times I tried calling out to him. Somehow, even back when I had just entered the room, the scent of despair had already wafted my way. He was unmoving, eyes open. I frantically suppressed the desire to scream, slowly extending my hand to grab the blanket and carefully pull it off. That's when his head turned towards me. My hair stood on end and I jumped away. His head rolled toward the side of the bed, stopping when the tip of his nose pressed into the mattress. Generally, you wouldn't be able to turn your neck that far without changing the rest of your posture, but there was no sign of anything moving below the neck. Instead, it was just his head, in a blatantly strange position. Once I had removed the blanket, the reason was abundantly clear. His neck had been severed from his body, decapitating him. Underneath the blanket, there was blood all over, practically searing my retinas with the bright red colour. I averted my eyes as if trying to let the colour drain from my vision, backing away immediately. My body started shaking of its own will. I felt suddenly cold. Was there a drop in temperature? Or was it because I had laid eyes on a repulsive corpse? It was so cold, and yet I became covered head to toe in an unpleasant sweat. I staggered towards the next guest room. Just like the last room, the door was slightly open. I could see inside the room a little through the crack. It seemed like, again, another detective was on the bed, under the blanket. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know anything. But I had to look. And I had to know. If I was going to call myself a detective, even just for a moment, I had to face reality. No matter what kind of tragedy or despair was waiting me. I entered the room and went up to the bed. It didn't look like there was any evidence of the room having been broke into. On the contrary, you could even say that the man's sleeping form seemed perfectly undisturbed and classically beautiful. He was wearing light grey sunglasses, but they weren't trying to conceal the shadow of death upon his face. Shita Enby. He's a detective in his prime. No, he was a detective. When I tried removing the blanket, I saw that his neck was also cut through. But that wasn't all. I noticed something else strange. The head that was lying face up on the pillow definitely belonged to the man called NB. But below the neck, the body looked like it belonged to someone else. I was pretty sure that NB had a strong muscular build, but the body lying underneath the blanket belonged to a stout, heavy-set, middle-aged man. I remembered that build. It belonged to another one of the detectives who had accompanied us. A man called Ko Inuzuka. What does this mean? This was just strange from start to finish. I had more information than I'd ever asked for swirling around in my tiny head. I leapt out of the room, moving towards the next guest room. I had a bad feeling I knew what would be in there. And, as expected, Ko Inuzuka's corpse was on the bed. But the question was whether it could really be called Inuzuka's corpse, since, also as expected, it seemed like the body belonged to someone else. It didn't seem like Enby's either. So does that mean that it belongs to Amino? The first one I found? I see. So either the heads, or the bodies, were swapped around in a circle. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to warm up my freezing body, and went back out into the hall dejected. Everything was all messed up. Why was something like this happening? At some point, of the 5 of us who had visited the Sirius Observatory, 3 had died. Not only that, but their heads had been severed, and then for some reason the bodies had been switched around from the heads and left that way. There wasn't anyone else other than us at the Sirius Observatory. On top of that, we'd been visited by snowstorms both before and after we'd arrived, so the building was currently isolated by the snow. It was safe to assume that this wasn't the intervention of an outsider. Eigo Amino, Shita Enby, Ko Inuzuka, Yui Samideri, Kyoko Kirigiri. Of these 5, 3 had been killed, and 2 were still alive. Naturally, I could safely assert that I hadn't killed them. There were parts of my memory that were still a bit fuzzy, but frankly, it was just ludicrous to think that I could kill 3 people, and yet have no sense of it all afterwards. And why would I handcuff myself in the first place? There was no doubt that someone else had been the one to restrain me. It's possible that whoever did that was planning on killing me next. So, who was that person? And going by process of elimination, I could only think of the culprit as the other survivor. She couldn't have. I returned to where she was. Kyoko Kirigiri was still lying on the floor of the hall. Her head was still firmly connected to the rest of her body. There was no doubt that it would have been much easier to cut through her slender neck, as opposed to those of the other men, but she hadn't received any damage, and the very weapon that seemed perfectly suited to the crime had fallen by her hand. If you ask me, just from looking at her, I wouldn't say she was anything but a pure and innocent girl. Could I really say that she went around chopping 3 men's heads off? That would be stupid. But I stepped back to observe her from a distance. She was a cute girl, but her features left me with the impression of enigmatic mystery. Talking with her too had demonstrated that she was wary, and concealed her true thoughts. Though maybe that was related to whatever reason she had for being a detective at such a young age. As I was pondering what reason that might be, I suddenly saw something glinting in her left hand. A key? I had a flash of intuition. The key to the handcuffs. If it could be said that the person who murdered the 3 detectives equaled the person who restrained me with the handcuffs, then wouldn't the key in her hand serve as proof that she was the killer? If the key really was the key to the handcuffs, I needed to make sure. And I wanted to get those handcuffs off of my right arm as soon as possible anyway. I approached her, softly extending my hand, trying to go unnoticed. If I wanted to steal the key, I first had to extract it from her grip. Her fingers looked almost like small white flower buds closing over it. One by one, I gently spread those fingers out. I discreetly removed the key and then backed away from her. She still hadn't noticed me. Immediately, I thrust the key into the keyhole by my wrist. It fit perfectly. I turned the key and it opened the handcuffs. The rush of freedom that I felt was joined by a simultaneously flood of despair. Is she really the culprit? I didn't know what had happened to her, but maybe she'd killed those men and then restrained me, and then lost consciousness and collapsed? Maybe she'd hit her limit for physical exertion, or maybe it was anemia. Testing one more time to see if the key was the real deal, I stuck it in the other keyhole and tried turning it. Just as I thought, the handcuff opened with a click. At that moment, Kirigiri stirred slightly at my feet, as if in response to the noise from the handcuffs. She's waking up. I immediately took half a step back. She opened her eyes while still on her side, staring down at the floor. At last, she shifted to sit up, rubbing her eyes, and looked up at me with a look of astonishment on her face. She was dazed and defenseless, sitting on the ground with her legs out to the side. And then, she abruptly noticed the shears on the floor. All at once, her innocent expression froze over. She reached out to her right hand to pick them up. "Don't move." I ordered her to stay still, but her hand didn't look like it was going to stop moving anytime soon. There was no other choice. I kicked off the floor to quickly jump towards her, locking her left wrist in the handcuffs. Then I tugged at the chain forcefully, attaching the other end of the handcuffs to the column of the nearby armchair's armrest. She was tied to the chair. It was only a one-person armchair, but her arms were so skinny it didn't seem like she would be able to drag it along with her. Her right hand couldn't reach the shears anymore. She stopped trying, looking up at me, expressionless, but I could tell that her eyes were hiding just a tiny bit of aggravation. "Why are you doing this, big sis?" Kirigiri asked calmly, without raising her voice. Big sis, so she said. But her eyes didn't even show the slightest bit of deference. Well, that was only to be expected. I'd just been tolerating her calling me that in the first place. Even though when she said it with such an innocent face, I could mistake her for my real little sister. I shook my head as if shaking off my sudden burst of sentimentality. "What do you mean, why? That's my line!" I kicked the shears across the floor, further away from her. "I thought maybe I'd finally made a good friend, but then you killed all three of them." "All three? Of them? Killed?" Her eyes went wide for a moment, before she looked down pensively. "I see. So I was too late." She hung her head, still sitting on the floor. Somehow, she looked really downhearted. "Don't play dumb. Why did you kill them? What were you planning to do to me?" "Calm down. I'm not the culprit." "You're not the culprit? Who else is going to be the culprit? 3 out of 5 of us were killed, and you and I are the only ones left. If I'm not the culprit, then you must be." "Where is the proof that you are not the culprit, big sis Yui?" "Proof? You've got a witness standing right here." I pointed at myself. "I was passed out unconscious until just a little while ago. When I came to, 3 people were dead. I'm as certain that I didn't kill them as I am that I'm a 16-year-old high school student, and that I'm as virginal as Virgo. In that case, I also plead innocence, calling myself as a witness." "Nuh-uh, that's not going to work for you. You're the one who had the shears that are probably the murder weapon, and you had the key for the handcuffs that were on my arm. The evidence is stacked up against you. How are you going to refute that argument?" I crossed my arms, looking down at her. She stretched out her legs, sitting up with her back to the side of the armchair, shifting up to look at me. I am clearly superior in both terms of physical position and morality here. "I only just laid eyes on the shears. I have absolutely no recollection of any key to any handcuffs." "You were holding it in your hand." "Someone made me hold it." Kirigiri shook her head slowly. "It seems that while I was unconscious, someone set me up." "Someone like?" "Who knows who it was. Perhaps it was one of the detectives who accompanied us here. Or perhaps it was you, big sis Yui." "I'm telling you, it's not me. I'm a victim." If you were to ask me, I would say that your suddenly attacking me makes you the more likely culprit. She raised her left hand, showing off the handcuffs. That wasn't attacking you. I had to do it out of self-defense. Because you were trying to pick up the shears, right? If you see a blood-stained set of shears on the ground, isn't it natural to want to pick it up and examine it? That's not natural. I would never do that. Even though you are a detective? She asked, tilting her head and turning her eyes up towards me. I bit my lip, at a loss for how to respond. People have been killed, haven't they? If that's the case, then that's all the more reasons to examine the weapon. Does the shape of the weapon match the wounds on the victims? Is anyone able to use this weapon? Or are there limitations? Are there any notable peculiarities about it? How heavy is it? How long is it? The list goes on. I know all that, I cut in, obstinate. But you shouldn't go touching them with your bare hands, little Miss Detective. You're going to leave extra fingerprints on them, aren't you? Yes, that was careless of me. I was still a little drowsy at the time. I'm sorry, she apologized obediently. Or maybe those shears are already covered in your fingerprints. You were thinking you could trick me by touching them now. Well, perhaps you could take it that way. She narrowed her eyes, looking down at the shears. Are you absolutely sure that these shears are the murder weapon? Probably. It looks like they'd be good for a quick decapitation. Decapitation? Right. The three of them had their heads separated from their bodies. Wait, you're the one who did it. I bet even with your scrawny arms you could still do a number on someone's neck with sturdy pruning shears like those. There was a momentary silence where she showed no reaction to my words. I thought maybe she would feel a little down when I suspected her, and maybe she would show a little grief in her expression, but she looked as unruffled as ever. In fact, it seems as if something very inexplicable has occurred. She looked flawlessly sparkling, with such clarity in her eyes that you might call it innocence. Yeah, I almost can't comprehend it, I shot back. To think a girl like you would be a twisted murderer. I hate to repeat myself, but I am not the culprit. Do you still not understand, Big Sis Yui? Then who is the culprit? Everyone else is dead. There's no way they're faking it. They were all decapitated. Are you just trying to say that you still think I'm the culprit? No, she replied without hesitation. Despite what I said earlier, I don't think you're the culprit. Well, that was a surprise. In a situation like this, she wouldn't have any valid counter-argument besides naming me as the culprit. Or does she have some ulterior motive behind excluding me from the pool of suspects? Why would you think that? Remember what happened right before we fell unconscious? I believe the time was around 8 o'clock. All of us were gathered here in the hall discussing what we should do about dinner. She was right. We had been puzzled by the fake request we'd received. It was dark outside, and we weren't able to go home during the snowstorm. We had gathered around the table to discuss our plans from there on out. And just then, with no warning, the first person collapsed. I'm pretty sure it was Amino. He suddenly crumpled up, falling from his feet onto his side. Then white smoke started spewing out of nowhere. Someone screamed, "Fire!" But there weren't any other signs of a fire. And it didn't feel hot. I had been nervously trying to figure out what to do, but before I knew it, I also started to lose consciousness. I had no idea what happened after that. That's the truth behind the smoke. Kirigiri pointed underneath the table. A small aluminium can, or can-type thing, had rolled under there. Huh? What is this? I crawled under the table, pulling it from under there. It looks like a can of juice, but there's no hole to drink from. It's a homemade smoke generator, isn't it? Someone rolled it under the table. We can feel fortunate that it didn't seem to have been tear gas or sleeping gas, but that hideous white smoke blanketed our fields of vision entirely. I had lost consciousness pretty quickly, so I didn't really know what had happened after that. Well, what exactly happened? Well, I don't really know, but everyone started collapsing, one after the other, and so I immediately pretended to collapse too, Kirigiri said. Huh? Pretended? What do you mean pretended? Are you saying that you're the only one that nothing happened to? Well, yes, because the smoke itself was harmless. I believe that everyone collapsed not because of a white smoke, but due to some other cause. It is a fact that the first person collapsed before the smoke even came out. I wonder if perhaps at some point you were made to ingest a soporific. Do you have any recollection of that? Soporific? I didn't know about the others, but at the very least I could speak for myself in saying that I hadn't ingested anything since arriving at the Sirius Observatory. There shouldn't have been any point at which I could have taken any drugs, but thinking back, right before I lost consciousness, I did feel sort of drunk. I thought I just wasn't feeling well, but... Still, what's up with you being the only person to escape danger? Perhaps it's thanks to my constant training, she said bluntly. Sensing danger is my specialty, but when I do sense it, it's often nothing more than a simple bad feeling or foreboding. And so frequently, it's only in looking back on events that I'm able to string together a logical explanation of events. Grandfather calls it hearing the Reaper's footsteps. I hear that great mathematicians are able to come up with propositions even when they skip some calculations along the way. I've heard a lot of episodes where they struggle to explain themselves afterwards. I wondered if she was also that kind of genius. No, right now, we don't really know why we feel unconscious, so it's possible she's just being silly. Or maybe she's the culprit, and so obviously she'd be able to avert danger. Wait, what training? Everyone started collapsing, one after the other. So, it was clear that some dreadful criminal plot was being put in motion, Kirigiri continued. I pretended to collapse to see what the culprit planned on doing, but when I did, I heard the Reaper's footsteps again. What happened? They were the culprit's footsteps. It seems our culprit is the very cautious type. They came closer to me, and then forced some strange drug on me. It wasn't a chloroform or ether. It likely wasn't an anesthetic. Perhaps it was some sort of synthetic narcotic. They covered my mouth with a handkerchief, and though I held my breath for a bit, so not to inhale it, at some point I still lost consciousness. So in the end she just fainted too? Wait a minute. Shears, decapitated corpses, drugs that cause fainting. Those things together had a familiar ring to them. No. I recognize that combination. There's no way that could be it. For now, I just need to hear out all that Kirigiri has to say. It might just be a misunderstanding. Did the culprit know that you were only pretending to faint? No, I don't think they did. They were likely going around and putting the handkerchief up to everyone to ensure that they actually fainted. And then what? Despite my hazy consciousness, I still attempted to resist. In the middle of her disinterested speech, this is the only place where she seemed to deliberately insert a pause, almost as if she were proudly announcing her results. So, I grabbed the culprit's hand. Grabbed? I asked, disappointed. Is that all? Well, yes, unfortunately, I was unable to scratch or bite the culprit, but I was at least able to touch their hand. With the white smoke clouding my vision, that sensation has become my only clue as to the identity of the culprit, Kirigiri said, looking down at her own fingertips. What did it feel like? It was a man's hand. Really? Are you sure about that? It was unremarkable, but unmistakably male. There's nowhere easier to sense the difference between men and women than the hands and fingertips. Is that really true in practice, though? Have you ever held a man's hand before? She looked taken aback by my question, freezing in place. There was a long pause, and then she just resumed her explanation, acting as if nothing happened. I have never murdered anyone, but I have read up on the sensations of murdering someone. This is a similar situation. You understand, don't you? Then continuing on. Wait, that's some pretty strange reasoning. Or maybe you haven't even held hands with any boy at all ever? I asked, teasing, effectively shutting her up again. She was pretty mad this time. She turned her head away, apparently shunning the conversation. Maybe I teased her a little too much. Even though she spoke and acted like she was indifferent, this reaction was surprisingly timid, so all of a sudden I didn't feel like teasing her anymore. Sorry. That was a weird place for me to butt in, I apologised. I'm sure you've at least held your dad's hand before. That's enough for your logic, so everything's fine. Now go on. I've forgotten about that. Huh? I'm saying I forgot what my father's hands feel like. Kirigiri narrowed her eyes, brushing back up with her bangs with her right hand. That was the most emotional gesture I'd seen from her up until that point. Ah, I see. Gotcha, I said, brushing it off. How complicated. It seemed like she had her own tangled circumstances, but getting too stuck on them would mean that the real conversation would never progress. So basically what you're trying to say is, since the person who caused you to faint was a man, then logically it can be concluded that I, Yui Samidori, am not the culprit, correct? Kirigiri nodded, still turned away. Among the detectives that were invited to the Sirius Observatory, Kyoko Kirigiri and myself were the only women. If her assertion was correct, then I could be excluded from the list of suspects. But that's what I've said since the very beginning, I sighed. The fact that I'm not the culprit is a fact that I already knew. I didn't even need proof for that. No, I still wouldn't call it definitive proof. What? Are you saying since you can't believe it unless you touch my hand to make sure of something? I asked, but Kirigiri just faced down, searching for the words to say before looking up with her eyes. She nodded just slightly. Your hand, she said hesitantly, asking for my right hand. She seemed pretty serious. Is this a trap? If she was the culprit, then maybe all the testimony she had just given was nothing but an excuse to get closer to me. Maybe she was hiding some kind of weapon and was trying to lure me in range. Kyoko Kirigiri. I still didn't know much about her. I hadn't really had the time to get to know her, and in the time that we did spend together, I mostly learned that she was mysterious and that she apparently had a complicated home life. Her claiming that I was innocent wasn't going to be enough to get me to trust her. Okay, let's shake hands and make up. I still didn't move closer to her though. But the real handshake will be after everything is settled, and we're both proven innocent. I wonder what that's supposed to mean. First, sit on the chair, I ordered. She had been sitting next to the chair this whole time, but in accordance with my demand, she sat down in the armchair. Now, show me your right hand. She presented her hand just like I told her to. I carefully drew close to her, taking her small hand in mine. It seemed as if it were made of glass, as if putting a little strength into it would shatter it, but I steadfastly refused to let her go. Her left hand was restrained by the handcuffs. With me holding her right hand like this, she wouldn't be able to attack me. We shook hands, as if evaluating each other, exchanging a glance. So, do you see the truth now? But we can talk about that later. I'm a detective too, so I'm going to try searching for my own truth. What will you do? First, I need to conduct a thorough search of the building, I said, still holding hands with her. I still suspect you. You're a detective too, so you should understand where I'm coming from, right? But if I want to keep suspecting you... Well, there's one major condition I still need to fulfill before I can indict you as the culprit. That is, I have to investigate the possibility of a crime committed from the outside. Was someone other than us 5 guests able to ever come or go from this place? You still hadn't confirmed that either way? Yeah, I mean, I was still half asleep. I scrambled to defend myself after she butted in. A crime committed by a 6th uninvited guest? Well, if there's any proof of that, I can let you go. You'll need to investigate quickly before the snow erases the evidence, particularly outside the windows and the entrance. There may still be traces of someone exiting or entering. I'll look into it. If an uninvited guest is in fact present, there is no doubt that that person is a man, and he may still be hiding in the building. Kirigiri looked a little worried. Yeah, I'm gonna check to see. By myself. Sorry, but I'm gonna have you stay like that for a while. And I'm gonna bind your right hand too. If she was the culprit, then she had to have been the one who prepared the handcuffs too. If that was the case, there was a chance she had a spare key hidden somewhere. If I left her unattended, she might unlock the handcuffs, so I needed to restrict the use of both of her hands. No offense. None taken. Actually, I'd be more concerned if you weren't the sort of person who would think of that, Kirigiri said with a cold expression. But even if I wanted to restrain her, I didn't have any extra handcuffs, or rope, or anything to tie her hands. Use my ribbon. Is that okay? If it's used to prove my innocence. I nodded and loosened one of the ribbons tied around her pigtail braids. I used the ribbon to tie her right hand to the armchair. And with that, both her hands were secured to the armchair. I'm going to go around and investigate each of the rooms one by one. If our unwanted guest is around somewhere, he might try to move between the rooms and hide himself somewhere else so that I don't see him. But if you're here in the central hall, you should see him right through him. So I'm serving as surveillance. You got it. But our guest could be super dangerous for you, with both of your hands tied up like that. I mean, he's a filthy murderer after all. If he shows up, just scream at the top of your lungs. I'll come rescue you in a flash. You'll rescue me? Well, the existence of an unwanted guest would prove your innocence. I'd protect you with all I got. I see. But I believe it will already be too late at that point. As always, Kirigiri acted like this had nothing to do with her. But if you would allow me to say so, I don't think you can logically conclude that I'm innocent simply because an uninvited guest might be present. That person's reason for hiding would not necessarily be related to the murders. For example... that doesn't matter, jeez, I interrupted. In a situation like this, if someone here is sneaking around, it's just common sense for me to kick their butt instead of doing anything else. I suppose, she responded meekly. I really doubt someone's coming in and out of this building out in the middle of a snowstorm in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. But whatever, I'm investigating. I left Kirigiri behind and went to investigate the closest room first. I opened the curtains, checked the locks on the windows, and investigated the state of the snow outside. It didn't take long for me to go around and check the windows in all of the rooms. The conclusion was that all the windows were locked from the inside. There wasn't anything amiss with the snow near them. None of the guest rooms had any air conditioning, vents, or anything that would lead out, except for the 3 windows. So following that train of thought, it was impossible for anyone to make it out with the windows locked. Next, I investigated the entranceway. The front door was locked, and even when I checked the snow outside, I didn't see any signs of anyone entering or exiting the building. In the end, I couldn't find any evidence of anyone going in or out. And I didn't sufficiently detect the presence of the hypothetical unwanted guest either. Which is to say, anyone other than me and Kirigiri who was alive. Kirigiri was still waiting for me in the hall, still restrained on the chair. Unfortunately, it looks like there was no one here except for you and me after all. There wasn't any sign of anything in the snow outside? Nah, I mean, in a storm like this, traces of anything that would probably be wiped away by the snow really quickly, but if a person was walking through that, then there would definitely be a dent in it at least. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary like that, and so the murder mystery became even more baffling. No, you could say it makes it a lot more simple. You could compare Sirius Observatory to an airtight bottle. As long as the bottle remains airtight, there won't ever be any more or less inside of it. So if there are 3 corpses and 2 survivors, one of the survivors has to be the culprit. Therefore, Kyoko Kirigiri is the culprit. The person in question looked up at me expectantly. It was too bad, but I couldn't release her from her restraints just yet. If my reasoning was correct, then there was no doubt that she was the culprit. But it was also true that I couldn't come to terms with that answer. Would it really be possible for a girl like her to kill 3 grown men and arrange their corpses on the beds? I don't know what's going on anymore. What is with this case? I complained unthinkingly. This weird building is one thing, and this weird request we got is another, but now finally I at least understand one thing. The incident described in that black letter wasn't an incident that we were requested to solve, but an incident that we were getting involved in ourselves. Big Sis Yui? Kirigiri interrupted. What are you talking about? Huh? The written request. There's a black letter with it, right? And it had the place, the weapon, and all that other stuff written on it. Show me the black letter you're talking about. If you want. I left Kirigiri sitting on the chair, going back to my room and digging through my backpack. I pulled out the black letter and returned to the hall. Unfold it and show me. I unthinkingly complied with her tense and urgent request. I took out the folded black washi writing paper from inside the black envelope. The contents of the letter were written on it with white brushstrokes. Kirigiri looked at those brushstrokes, and then it seemed as if her body temperature dropped significantly, her face growing pale. Big Sis Yui, this is no ordinary murder case. Huh? What do you mean? This is most likely a game. End of chapter 1.